I'd been on Kalor's Reach 11 months before I learned to stop reading the weather off the sky and start reading it off Kessa Ilvain's face. The Reach wasn't much to look at. A relay station bolted to a ridge of black rock above the iron flats, half of it always humming with the low drone of the ore survey arrays, the other half always cold, because the budget for heating ran out 2 decks below where anybody with rank actually slept. I ran systems, comms, power routing, the kind of work that keeps a station's blood moving and nobody notices until it stops. Kessa ran hazard monitoring, which on Kalor's Reach mostly meant sitting alone in a cramped side bay, watching magnetic flux graphs that nobody else wanted to watch. She was Ilvain. I didn't know much about the Ilvain when I got there. Gray-skinned, quiet-voiced, eyes so dark they didn't seem to have a pupil so much as a depth, but I learned fast that the rest of the station knew exactly one thing about them, and it wasn't kind. Something about an old war, an old exile, a caste that used to run courts and now ran instrument panels on fringe stations nobody else wanted to staff. Station Director Corin Wex never said it outright. He didn't have to. Every time Kessa filed a flux anomaly report, he read the name at the top before he read the numbers underneath, and he filed it the same way every time, under things to worry about later, which was Wex's polite term for the trash. I started checking her numbers myself. Not because I doubted Wex's right to run his station how he wanted. I didn't have the rank to doubt much of anything, but because I'd spent 20 years in military comms learning that the readings don't care who's holding the instrument, and hers were clean, meticulous. She flagged deviations to 4 decimal places, and then flagged her own margin of error underneath them, which is more honesty than half the officers I served under ever showed. The first time I told her I'd looked, she stared at me like I'd spoken a language she hadn't heard in years. "You checked the math," she said. "Not a question." "Somebody should," I said, and went back to my console, because I didn't know what else to say to a woman who looked that surprised that a person had simply done their job. It went on like that for weeks. She'd log an anomaly, a flux spike over the iron flats, small, localized, gone in an hour, and Wex would file it under later, and I'd sit with her afterward, going over the raw feed, because it was easier company than the mess hall, and because somewhere in there, I'd started to like the quiet, careful way she talked, like every word had already been checked twice before she spent it. The spikes got bigger. That was the thing nobody but us seemed to track. Not the individual events, but the curve underneath them. Each flux surge pulled a little more iron out of true, warped a few more degrees of magnetic field, and left the ground under the flats humming for longer before it settled. Kessa mapped it against the old ore survey charts and found what she was afraid to find. The anomaly wasn't wandering, it was following the vein. The same vein that ran 40 kilometers south, directly under Haldrick's Landing, where 6,000 people didn't know any of this was happening. She brought it to Wex, with 3 weeks of data behind her. He gave her 4 minutes. "Ms. Ilvain," he said, not looking up from his tablet, "your caste has a documented history of reading catastrophe into weather patterns. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying I'm not evacuating a settlement on the word of a hazard tech with a reputation problem." I was standing in the doorway. I watched her hands stay perfectly still on the table, which told me more than tears would have. "Then it's my word too," I said. Wex looked at me like I'd grown a second head. "Kellen, you run the coffee maker's power draw. I run every system on this station, including hers, and I've been cross-checking her data for 6 weeks. It's clean." I stepped up to the table and pulled the report toward me. "Co-sign it under my name. Send it up the chain as a joint filing. If it's wrong, it costs me my rating same as her. If it's right, you've got 3 weeks to move people instead of 3 hours." I want to say I did it out of pure conviction about the science. Some of that's true. But if I'm honest, most of it was simpler than that. I'd watched this woman get talked over in every room I'd ever seen her in, and I was tired of it, and I had exactly one thing to offer her that the rest of the station wouldn't. My name on a piece of paper, worth something only because nobody had any reason to distrust it yet. Wex sent it up, grudging, unconvinced, but he sent it, because a joint filing from his systems chief wasn't as easy to bury as one from the tech everyone already had a story about. Kessa found me afterward in the cold half of the station, where I went most nights because nobody else did. "You didn't have to spend your name on me," she said. "Wasn't spending it on you. I said. Spent it on the math. You just happened to be right about the math. She was quiet a long moment. The kind of quiet I'd learned meant she was deciding whether to say something true. Everyone on this station has decided who I am before I've said a word to them. You're the only one who ever believed her. The data, I mean. Believed what I actually said, instead of what my name told them to expect. Same thing, I said. You said it. I believed it. I don't see the difference. She looked at me like that was the first time anyone had put it that plainly, and something in her face came unguarded for just a second before she caught it again. Those 9 days were the longest I've lived through, and I've lived through some long ones. Kessa didn't sleep more than a few hours a night, running updated curves off every new reading, tightening her window from a range of days down to a range of hours. I brought her coffee she didn't drink, and sat with her while she worked, not because there was anything useful my hands could do with a flux equation, but because I'd decided somewhere along the way that she shouldn't have to carry the waiting alone, not after carrying the disbelief alone for as long as she had. Twice I watched her hesitate over a revised timeline before sending it, second-guessing herself out of old habit, and both times I told her the same thing. Send it. Let them argue with the numbers instead of with you. She sent it both times. The anomaly hit Haldrick's Landing 9 days later, and by then, the town had 4,000 of its 6,000 people out, the hospital fully evacuated, and a perimeter holding at the edge of the flats when the sky over the vein turned the color of old iron, and the ground began to sing. I watched it on the relay feed from the Reach, Kessa beside me, both of us not breathing. The flux tore loose fencing, vehicles, anything unsecured within half a kilometer, dragged it spinning into a column that stood over the empty streets, like something out of an old war god's temper. And then, an hour later, exactly as her curve had predicted, it collapsed back into the vein and went still. No one died. 211 people who'd refused to leave their homes got pulled out by emergency crews in the last 6 hours before the surge. Crews that had that extra time only because someone had put a filing through 3 weeks early, with 2 names on it instead of 1. Wex came to the hazard bay 2 days later. He didn't apologize, men like him rarely do, straight out, but he stood in the doorway and said, "Your reports go through without co-signature from now on, Ilvain," which was as close as he was built to get, and then he left before either of us could answer. Kessa sat very still after he'd gone. Then she reached up and peeled back the edge of the glove she always wore on her left hand, the one I'd never once seen her take off, and underneath it was a mark pressed into the gray of her palm. Old, formal, the kind of thing you don't get from working a hazard console. A crest, a name older than the one she'd given the station. "I wasn't hiding it because I was ashamed," she said quietly. "I was hiding it because the last time people knew who I was, they decided that was all I was. I wanted one place where the numbers spoke first." I looked at the mark, and then at her, and didn't feel the ground shift the way I think she was braced for it to. "They did speak first," I said. "That's the only reason I ever knew you at all." She didn't cover the mark back up. She just sat there with her hand open on the table between us, letting me see it, letting it mean whatever it was going to mean, now that someone had already decided, weeks before he knew any of it, that she was worth believing.